Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 17, Government Price Fixing. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this read as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, at the end of each read, we will be doing an analysis and review of the read. So I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. Final bit of housekeeping. This chapter is kind of on the long side. And in either case, because of its length, Henry Hazlitt has broken up the chapter into 5 parts. I'll let you know when we get to those parts. These parts have been labeled purely numerically, and there is no label for part 1. So because of that, I'm going to be inserting part 1 after I read the title of the chapter. So without further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read, which is Chapter 17, Government Price Fixing. Part 1. We have seen what some of the effects are of governmental efforts to fix prices of commodities above the levels to which free markets would otherwise have carried them. Let us now look at some of the results of government attempts to hold the prices of commodities below their natural market levels. The latter attempt is made in our day by nearly all governments in wartime. We shall not examine here the wisdom of wartime price fixing. The whole economy in total war is necessarily dominated by the state, and the complications that would have to be considered would carry us too far beyond the main question with which this book is concerned. But wartime price fixing, wise or not, is in almost all countries continued for at least long periods after the war is over, when the original excuse for starting it has disappeared. It is the wartime inflation that mainly causes the pressure for price fixing. At the time of writing, when practically every country is inflating, though most of them are at peace, price controls are always hinted at, even when they are not imposed. Though they are always economically harmful, if not destructive, they have at least a political advantage from the standpoint of the office holders. By implication, they put the blame for higher prices on the greed and rapacity of businessmen, instead of on the inflationary monetary policies of the office holders themselves. Let us first see what happens when the government tries to keep the price of a single commodity, or a small group of commodities, below the price that would be set in a free competitive market. When the government tries to fix maximum prices for only a few items, it usually chooses certain basic necessities on the ground that it is most essential that the poor be able to obtain these at a quote-unquote reasonable cost. Let us say that the items chosen for this purpose are bread, milk, and meat. The argument for holding down the price of these goods will run something like this. If we leave beef, let us say, to the mercies of the free market, the price will be pushed up by competitive bidding so that only the rich will get it. People will get beef not in proportion to their need, but only in proportion to their purchasing power. If we keep the price down, everyone will get his fair share. The first thing to be noticed about this argument is that if it is valid, the policy adopted is inconsistent and timorous. For if purchasing power rather than need determines the distribution of beef at a market price of $2.25 a pound, it would also determine it, though perhaps to a slightly smaller degree, at, say, a legal ceiling price of $1.50 a pound. The purchasing power rather than need argument, in fact, holds as long as we change everything for beef whatever. It would cease to apply only if beef were given away. But schemes for maximum price fixing usually begin as efforts to, quote-unquote, keep the cost of living from rising. And so their sponsors unconsciously assume that there is something peculiarly quote-unquote normal or sacrosanct about the market price at the moment from which their control starts. That starting or previous price is regarded as quote-unquote reasonable, and any price above that as quote-unquote unreasonable, regardless of changes in the conditions of production or demand since that starting price was first established. Part 2. In discussing this subject, there is no point in assuming a price control that would fix prices exactly where a free market would place them in any case. That would be the same as having no price control at all. We must assume that the purchasing power in the hands of the public is greater than the supply of goods available, and that prices are being held down by the government below the levels to which a free market would put them. Now, we cannot hold the price of any commodity below its market level without in time bringing about two consequences. The first is to increase the demand for that commodity. Because the commodity is cheaper, people are both tempted to buy and can afford to buy more of it. The second consequence is to reduce the supply of that commodity. Because people buy more, the accumulated supply is more quickly taken from the shelves of merchants. But in addition to this, production of that commodity is discouraged. Profit margins are reduced or wiped out. The marginal producers are driven out of business. Even the most efficient producers may be called upon to turn out their products at a loss. This happened in World War II when slaughterhouses were required by the Office of Price Administration to slaughter and process meat for less than the cost of cattle on the hoof and the labors of slaughter and processing. If we did nothing else, therefore, the consequence of fixing a maximum price for a particular commodity would be to bring about a shortage of that commodity. But this is precisely the opposite of what the government regulators originally wanted to do. For it is the very commodities selected for maximum price fixing that the regulators most want to keep in abundant supply. But when they limit the wages and the profits of those who make these commodities, without also limiting the wages and profits of those who make luxuries or semi-luxuries, they discourage the production of the price-controlled necessities while they relatively stimulate the production of less essential goods. Some of these consequences in time become apparent to the regulators, who then adopt various other devices and controls in an attempt to avert them. Among these devices are rationing, cost control, subsidies, and universal price fixing. Let us look at each of these in turn. When it becomes obvious that a shortage of some commodity is developing as a result of a price fixed below the market, rich consumers are accused of taking quote-unquote more than their fair share. Or, if it is a raw material that enters into manufacture, individual firms are accused of quote-unquote hoarding it. The government then adopts a set of rules concerning who shall have priority in buying that commodity, or to whom and in what quantities it shall be allocated, or how it shall be rationed. If a rationing system is adopted, it means that each consumer can have only a certain maximum supply, no matter how much he is willing to pay for more. If a rationing system is adopted, in brief, it means that the government adopts a double price system, or a dual currency system, in which each consumer must have a certain number of coupons, or points, in addition to a given amount of ordinary money. In other words, the government tries to do through rationing part of the job that a free market would have done through prices. I say only part of the job because rationing merely limits the demand without also stimulating the supply, as a higher price would have done. The government may try to assure supply through extending its control over the costs of production of a commodity. To hold down the retail price of beef, for example, it may fix the wholesale price of beef, the slaughterhouse price of beef, the price of live cattle, the price of feed, the wages of farmhands. To hold down the delivered price of milk, it may try to fix the wages of milk truck drivers, the price of containers, the farm price of milk, the price of feedstuffs. To fix the price of bread, it may fix the wages in bakeries, the price of flour, the profits of millers, the price of wheat, and so on. But as the government extends this price fixing backwards, it extends at the same time the consequences that originally drove it to this course. Assuming that it has the courage to fix these costs and is able to enforce its decisions, then it merely, in turn, creates shortages of the various factors, labor, feedstuffs, wheat, or whatever, that enter into the production of the final commodities. Thus, the government is driven to controls in ever-widening circles, and the final consequence will be the same as that of universal price fixing. The government may try to meet this difficulty through subsidies. It recognizes, for example, that when it keeps the price of milk or butter below the level of the market, or below the relative level at which it fixes other prices, a shortage may result because of lower wages or profit margins for the production of milk or butter as compared with other commodities. Therefore, the government attempts to compensate for this by paying a subsidy to the milk and butter producers. Passing over the administrative difficulties involved in this, and assuming that the subsidy is just enough to assure the desired relative production of milk and butter, it is clear that, though the subsidy is paid to producers, those who are really being subsidized are the consumers. For the producers are on net balance getting no more for their milk and butter than if they had been allowed to charge the free market price in the first place. But the consumers are getting their milk and butter at a great deal below the free market price. They are being subsidized to the extent of the difference, that is, by the amount of subsidy paid ostensibly to the producers. Now, unless the subsidized commodity is also rationed, it is those with the most purchasing power that can buy most of it. This means they are being subsidized more than those with less purchasing power. Who subsidizes the consumers will depend upon the incidence of taxation. But men in their role of taxpayers will be subsidizing themselves in their role of consumers. It becomes a little difficult to trace in this maze precisely who is subsidizing whom. What is forgotten is that subsidies are paid for by someone, and that no method has been discovered by which the community gets something for nothing. Part 3. Price fixing may often appear for a short period to be successful. It can seem to work well for a while, particularly in wartime, when it is supported by patriotism and a sense of crisis. But the longer it is in effect, the more its difficulties increase. When prices are arbitrarily held down by government compulsion, demand is chronically in excess of supply. We have seen that if the government attempts to prevent a shortage of a commodity by reducing also the prices of the labor, raw materials, and other factors that go into its cost of production, it creates a shortage of these in turn. But not only will the government, if it purchases in this course, find it necessary to extend price control more and more downwards or vertically, it will find it no less necessary to extend price control horizontally. If we ration one commodity and the public cannot get enough of it, though it still has excess purchasing power, it will turn to some substitute. The rationing of each commodity as it grows scarce, in other words, must put more and more pressure on the unrationed commodities that remain. If we assume that the government is successful in its efforts to prevent black markets, or at least prevents them from developing on a sufficient scale to nullify its legal prices, continued price control must drive it to the rationing of more and more commodities. This rationing cannot stop with consumers. In World War II, it did not stop with consumers. It was applied, first of all, in fact, in the allocation of raw materials to producers. The natural consequence of a thoroughgoing overall price control, which seeks to perpetuate a given historic price level, in brief, must ultimately be a completely regimented economy. Wages would have to be held down as rigidly as prices. Labor would have to be rationed as ruthlessly as raw materials. The end result would be that the government would not only tell each consumer precisely how much of each commodity he could have, it would tell each manufacturer precisely what quantity of each raw material he could have and what quantity of labor. Competitive bidding for workers could no more be tolerated than competitive bidding for materials. The result would be petrified totalitarian economy, with every business, firm, and every worker at the mercy of the government, and with a final abandonment of all the traditional liberties we have known. For as Alexander Hamilton pointed out in the Federalist Papers nearly 2 centuries ago, quote, "A power over man's subsistence amounts to a power over his will." End quote. Part 4. These are the consequences of what might be described as quote-unquote perfect, long-continued, and quote-unquote non-political price control. As was so amply demonstrated in one country after another, particularly in Europe during and after World War II, some of the more fantastic errors of the bureaucrats were mitigated by the black market. In some countries, the black market kept growing at the expense of the legally recognized fixed price market until the former became, in effect, the market. By nominally keeping the price ceilings, however, the politicians in power tried to show that their hearts, if not their enforcement squads, were in the right place. Because the black market, however, finally supplanted the legal price ceiling market, it must not be supposed that no harm was done. The harm was both economic and moral. During the transition period, the large, long-established firms, with a heavy capital investment and a great dependence upon the retention of public goodwill, are forced to restrict or discontinue production. Their place is taken by fly-by-night concerns with little capital and little accumulated experience in production. These new firms are inefficient compared with those they displace. They turn out inferior and dishonest goods at much higher production costs than the older concerns would have required for continuing to turn out their former goods. A premium is put on dishonesty. The new firms owe their very existence or growth to the fact that they are willing to violate the law. Their customers conspire with them, and as a natural consequence, demoralization spreads into all business practices. It is seldom, moreover, that any honest effort is made by the price-fixing authorities merely to preserve the level of prices existing when their efforts began. They declare that their intention is to, quote-unquote, hold the line. Soon, however, under the guise of, quote-unquote, correcting inequities, or, quote-unquote, social injustices, they begin a discriminatory price-fixing, which gives most to those groups that are politically powerful, and least to other groups. As political power today is most commonly measured by votes, the groups that the authorities most often attempt to favor are workers and farmers. At first, it is contended that wages and living costs are not connected, that wages can easily be lifted without lifting prices. When it becomes obvious that wages can be raised only at the expense of profits, the bureaucrats begin to argue that profits were already too high anyway, and that lifting wages and holding prices will still permit a quote-unquote fair profit. As there is no such thing as a uniform rate of profit, as profits differ with each concern, the result of this policy is to drive the least profitable concerns out of business altogether and to discourage or stop the production of certain items. This means unemployment, a shrinkage in production, and a decline in living standards. Part 5. What lies at the base of the whole effort to fix maximum prices? There is first of all a misunderstanding of what it is that has been causing prices to rise. The real cause is either a scarcity of goods or a surplus of money. Legal price ceilings cannot cure either. In fact, as we have just seen, they merely intensify the shortage of goods. What to do about the surplus of money will be discussed in a later chapter. But one of the errors that lie behind the drive for price fixing is the chief subject of this book. Just as the endless plans for raising prices of favored commodities are the result of thinking of the interests only of the producers immediately concerned and forgetting the interests of consumers, so the plans for holding down prices by legal edict are the result of thinking of the short-run interests of people only as consumers and forgetting their interests as producers. And the political support for such policies springs from a similar confusion in the public mind. People do not want to pay more for milk, butter, shoes, furniture, rent, theater tickets, or diamonds. Whenever any of these items rises above its previous level, the consumer becomes indignant and feels that he is being rooked. The only exception is the item he makes himself. Here he understands and appreciates the reason for the rise. But he is always likely to regard his own business as in some way an exception. Quote, "Not my own business," he will say. Quote, is peculiar, quote, now my own business, he will say, is peculiar and the public does not understand it. Labor costs have gone up. Raw material prices have gone up. This or that raw material is no longer being imported and must be made at a higher cost at home. Moreover, the demand for the product has increased, and the business should be allowed to charge the prices necessary to encourage its expansion to supply this demand, end quote. And so on. Everyone as consumer buys 100 different products. As producer, he makes usually only one. He can see the inequity in holding down the price of that. And just as each manufacturer wants a higher price for his particular product, so each worker wants a higher wage or salary. Each can see, as producer, that price control is restricting production in his line. But nearly everyone refuses to generalize this observation, for it means that he will have to pay more for the products of others. Each one of us, in brief, has a multiple economic personality. Each one of us is producer, taxpayer, consumer. The policies he advocates depend upon the particular aspect under which he thinks of himself at the moment. For he is sometimes Dr. Jekyll and sometimes Mr. Hyde. As a producer, he wants inflation, thinking chiefly of his own services or product. As a consumer, he wants price ceilings, thinking chiefly of what he has to pay for the products of others. As a consumer, he may advocate or acquiesce in subsidies. As a taxpayer, he will resent paying them. Each person is likely to think that he can so manage the political forces that he can benefit from a rise from his own product, while his raw material costs are legally held down, and at the same time benefit as a consumer from price control. But the overwhelming majority will be deceiving themselves. For not only must there be at least as much loss as gain from this political manipulation of prices, there must be a great deal more loss than gain, because price fixing discourages and disrupts employment and production. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. Welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So I want to just say that this is one of my favorite reads before we even get into the analysis. This chapter basically could have been the only chapter in the book, and it would have sufficed just to resolve a lot of fallacies that are commonly pervaded. It would have sufficed as basically an introductory lesson. This chapter and this read is the final chapter in his kind of subsection on commodities exchange that we've been talking about, and this is the best chapter in the section, and I would say probably the best and most important read in the entire book. And the read could really be reduced to just part 2. And that is because that is just a conversation on the law of demand and by extension, the law of supply as well. Now, I went into greater detail on this, and I actually illustrated in that video using visual diagrams at this exact point and these laws and basically everything that's in this chapter in a video I put on my other channel, which I will link to in this video description on demand. So if you want to get a more in-depth, detailed review of everything Hazlitt's talking about in this section, do check out that video. So I want to get into what you can get out of basically part 2 alone in just a minute. But first, we do have to have a little bit of an aside about what he said about wartime at the beginning of the chapter. He did mention that we shall not examine here the wisdom of wartime price fixing. The whole economy in total war is necessarily dominated by the state, and the complications that have to be considered would carry us too far beyond the main question with which this book is concerned. There's a footnote that he puts at that, and at the end of the sentence, and he rarely ever uses them throughout the course of this book. So I want to read that footnote real quick. My conclusion, however, is that while some government priorities, allocations, or rationing may be unavoidable, government price fixing is likely to be especially harmful in total war. Whereas maximum price fixing requires rationing to make it work, even temporarily, the converse is not true. This is kind of a complicated thing to talk about, but first things first, real quick, the motivations of a government and of a country during wartime may be completely altered because of the fact that you are looking at an actual existential threat to the existence of that country. In this case, I would argue that In terms of the allocation of scarce resources, prices are still the best way to do that. But what happens is now that government, which is in charge of the army, let's say, has such a crucial demand for a certain good or service, they wind up paying an unconscionable a lot more for it. So they are willing to pay like 10 times the price of what you would normally pay for something like aluminum or steel or firearms or war material in general. And in that case, all that would happen is that the private consumer would just be outbid for that sort of thing. And you would still have the allocation. In that case, yes, you would have to pay a lot more in taxes. But in this case, the rationale for paying a whole lot more in taxes is that it costs you a whole lot more to defend your life and liberty. One of the very few things, if you were to take a libertarian approach, even a libertarian approach to government, one of the very few things the government ought to do is protect life and limb of its citizenry from the invasion of outsiders during wartime. And when I say invasion, I mean like actual hordes that are looking to kill the people within your country's borders. So in this case, you would always want to secure those borders against those invading hordes. However, in certain times of your country's existence, it might be cheaper to do that than in others. And obviously, you might have an interest in paying more for taxes during those times. And the same thing is kind of true about feeding the masses during wartime. He kind of alludes to this. Hazlitt kind of alludes to this on page 118, but the short version is that the same thing is true of feeding the masses. If the government is willing to pay 10 times as much as normal for bread, you're going to get outside of government consumption a shortage. In this case, what has happened is the demand curve, because the involvement of government in the purchase of bread has gone completely through the roof. And you can't change the supply curve. So what happens is the price winds up going completely through the roof. So what winds up happening is you do have a shortage. In this circumstance, you could make up for that shortage because the government is buying all the bread. Let's say you're worried about, the poor starving. Well, in this case, I've always suggested that it could be seen as an alternative to forced conscription, to mandatory conscription during times of war, to just simply offer those who volunteer to sign up for the military something like 10 times their normal salary for a short period. Or you offer bonuses, deployment bonuses that are 10 times the normal deployment bonus. So in this case, that person who is poor on the streets just joins the military. Now, I know everyone's going to say, well, then the poor are going to be the entirety of the military. I don't care who's in the military. All I want is people in the military during time of war. I don't know how, other than by force, you convince people to join the military. Now, if they're doing it voluntarily, there might be some incentive to actually be more productive on the war front. Obviously, a willing combatant in time of war is something that I would find less moral objection to than involuntary conscripts. And the U.S. actually found this out in as early as World War II, where they were having problems with their conscripts being willing enough to actually pull the trigger and kill somebody on the other side of the firing line. So those are just my thoughts on how this might look in wartime. And I think Hazlitt would actually agree with that because he kind of alludes to it, like I said, on page 118. So beyond that, though, what Hazlitt is saying in this chapter could be summed up with what he says on page 119. It's a short enough section, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. Bear with me, folks. I know we just read this. Because the commodity is cheaper, in the case where we have a fixed maximum price ceiling, people are both tempted to buy and can afford to buy more of it. We know this. You go to the hardware store. If something is cheaper or on sale, you go to the grocery store. If something's cheaper on sale, you're going to buy that instead of the other thing. You may even buy more of it than you normally would. The second consequence is to reduce the supply of that commodity. He explains, because people buy more, the accumulated supply is more quickly taken from the shelves of merchants. But in addition to this, production of that commodity is discouraged. If I have less capability to actually turn a profit on the thing, then I'm going to necessarily produce less of it. We'll get into that in a minute. Profit margins are reduced or wiped out, as we explained. The marginal producers, those on the fringe, are driven out of business. So those producers who could make a profit, but only just barely, they go out of business completely. Even the most efficient producers may be called upon to turn out their product at a loss. This happened in World War II when slaughterhouses were required by the Office of Price Administration to slaughter and process meat for less than the cost of cattle on the hoof and the labor of slaughter and processing. So basically they were forced to sell their beef for less than what it cost for them to get that beef to the market. If we did nothing else, therefore, the consequence of fixing a maximum price for a particular commodity would be to bring about a shortage of that commodity. That commodity could be labor, in which case you have is unemployment. And he talks about this quite a bit throughout the course of this read. And this is something I've illustrated in that other video I've talked about, which I've linked in this video's description, on the law of demand. So if you want to see more on this topic, do check out that video. It's kind of long, so it goes into much greater detail than we're going to go into in this chapter. The response, of course, is that even if you perfectly price fix, you're going to wind up with shortages of supply, which means that there are some people that aren't going to get their insulin because you've lowered the price to such a point that no one's making the insulin, right? So a response to that might be something like rationing. Hazlitt addresses this on page 120. In other words, the government tries to do through rationing the part of the job that a free market would have done through prices. I say only part of the job because rationing merely limits the demand without also stimulating the supply, as a higher price would have done. So basically, if you have a perfect rationing system, all you've done is done what the free market already does anyways, without the added cost of the giant added cost of a centralized bureaucracy. He also when he makes the caveat, says only part of the job because rationing merely limits the demand without also stimulating supply, as a higher price would have done. What that means is that if all you're doing is artificially affecting these prices and the distribution of the final product, you're not actually increasing the amount that's being made. You're just redistributing in a way that you find more suitable to your politic, the way that these things are distributed, than increasing the total number of unit widgets that are actually being produced. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So Hazlitt actually considers taking this idea to its logical end. If you take everything within this to its logical end, you wind up with centralized control. And let's imagine a centralized control of the means, not of production, of the means of production, but of all of productivity, and basically the ownership of all private property. Let's say it was somehow perfectly atomized. Let's say the centralized control was always and constantly perfectly changing and reacting to market influences. We call that the free market. So why have totalitarian control over that free market and the risks that come with that? Why have the added expense of a central bureaucracy when you can just simply have the free market? Why pay bureaucrats to do the same thing that happens naturally? And this is what he's talking about in page 120. And even when that happens, you're still going to have less of the thing because rationing discourages production of the thing and naturally will encourage the production of something else. So this is kind of another leap that he's making here. So in addition to that lesson, that even under a perfect centralized control, you just have the free market. Even where you don't have shortages, you just simply have the free market with the added cost of the bureaucracy and the added risk of the totalitarian state that requires. Beyond that, what you've effectively done by discouraging production with decreased profit margins of the thing is encouraged more production in a market where there is less profitability. Now, what is profit? Profit is the measure of nothing more than, in a consensual transaction, is nothing more than the amount that both parties gain. Because if I'm willing to pay a giant price for the thing, that means I value the thing way more than I value the money that I'm spending for the thing. So I gain the value of the thing, and the person who made the thing gains a crap load of those dollars. This is an extension of Smith's lesson that we've talked about throughout the course of this read in great detail. I'll put a link to my series on interference that I have on my other channel as well that goes into this matter in great detail. Hazlitt does address this on page 120. All right, this actually starts on page 119. But when they limit wages and the profits of those who make these commodities, without also limiting the wages and profits of those who make luxuries and semi-luxuries, they discourage the production of the price-controlled necessities while they relatively stimulate the production of less essential goods. So in this case, when he says less essential goods, he is referring to stimulating the production of, say, something like televisions versus bread. But the point is that you're stimulating the production of something that you wouldn't naturally have stimulated. You're removing that element of consent, and you're removing that relative gain that both parties to the transaction are getting. So you're actually encouraging the production and consumption of things that are less desirable at an individual and atomized matter. So one way to overcome that this discouragement of production is through subsidization. Of course, there's an easy lesson to debunk all of this that we should have all learned as children. Smith points this out on page 122. What is forgotten is that subsidies are paid for by someone, and that no method has been discovered by which the community gets something for nothing. Again, we learned this lesson as children. If you're going to just simply subsidize a thing with taxation, again, this isn't going to be one hand washing the other. This is going to be a light bulb powering a solar panel, which powers the light bulb. And we all know what happens to that light bulb at the end of just a few seconds of this. The light bulb dies. It loses its power. It loses its luminosity, and the solar panel winds up doing nothing. So this is one of my favorite reads. We can actually wrap things up right there. We are getting kind of long on the long side for a fairly short read. For not a fairly short read, but a read that isn't really all that long. This is one of my favorite reads in the entire book. And in the world of economics, this read is also one of my favorite reads. Frankly, it couldn't be more timely. And I was really encouraged as I was reading this, doing my read before the read, if you will, for this chapter. Because it really couldn't be more timely. I was really excited to get this video up because everything that's in here is painfully obviously true, and especially the way that Hazlitt presents it. It becomes painfully obviously true. And by the way, when I say true, this isn't true by evidence, by way of evidence. This isn't true by way of testing the thing and seeing through observation what happens. This is true by way of proof, which I've talked about in previous other videos. This is something like PV equals nRT, the ideal gas law. When pressure goes up, all things remaining the same, temperature must also go up. When temperature increases, all things remaining the same, pressure must go up. When pressure goes up, all things remaining the same, otherwise remaining the same, volume must go up. Volume must go down, excuse me. So that's an inverse relationship. We know this without even having to fill up a balloon and testing the pressure. We know this without having to fill up the balloon and testing the volume. We know this without having to fill up the balloon and testing the temperature. PV equals nRT is the ideal gas law. This is something that is unfixable. This is something that is true by way of explanation. This isn't us trying to explain why that's the case. It's just a mere observation of reality. In the same way that the law of demand and the law of supply are laws, because they are not there to explain what we're observing. They're there to simply describe what we're observing. So love this chapter. Love how poignant it is. And by the way, as we're closing, this book, as a reminder, was written almost 80 years ago, and it couldn't be more poignant today, as expressed most poignantly on page 124. I was not expecting Hazlitt to have written this. Soon, however, under the guise of quote-unquote correcting inequities or quote-unquote social injustices, they begin a discriminatory price fixing which gives most to those groups that are politically powerful and least to other groups. So without getting myself in trouble, does any of this sound familiar to us today in 2021? That's why I really love this read. That's why I really love Hazlitt. That's why I think this is one of the best and most important reads in this chapter. And I hope for everyone who's watching this series, bookmark this video. And if you aren't paying that close attention, rewatch the whole thing because, man, this is a really important and great read. And with that, we will close today's analysis and review. We will continue with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson in our next read in this book with Chapter 18, which is entitled What Rent Control Does, which we should be able to figure out from this read. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.